Good evening. I see some people logging on here. Welcome to our faculty session. This is actually the last faculty session for the month, so we're saving the best for last year. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Carrie Feierabend. I'm one of our admissions counselors here at Binghamton University. Today we are joined by Professor Deanne Westerman of our psychology department. Dr. Deanne Westerman is a professor and director of the undergraduate program for psychology here at Binghamton University. Her research is in the area of human memory and is primarily focused on recognition memory processes. She's interested in understanding the nature of familiarity and the attributional factors that influence memory and memory decision making. So today she's going to be talking to us a little bit about her research in a mini lecture entitled Autobiographical Memory. There it is. So what parts of your life story do you remember best? I might be participating as well when we're trying to remember. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A if they are related to Dr. Westerman's research or the psychology department. We'll try to go ahead and answer those at the end of her session. If you have questions related to admissions, I'll be on the back end answering the questions and answers throughout the presentation. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Westerman, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So welcome to our webinar. Really looking forward to meeting some of you in person. I teach several large undergraduate courses. So I teach our stats course and, of course, on human memory. You'll get a little snippet of my human memory class in this little mini lecture. But I just wanted to first tell you about the psychology department and give you a little bit of an overview. We have a fantastic advising office that can help you also kind of plan your schedule, plan your path through the major. I assume that you're tuning in because you're at least possibly thinking of being a psychology major. It is one of the more popular majors on campus, or maybe you're just interested in the topic, which is great too. So I thought I would just tell you a little bit about the department just briefly. So I am broadcasting from Science 4. Actually, we have a pretty large faculty, and we have 3 buildings on campus depending on what people study, and they're sort of segmented by different research specialties. And but I'm in kind of what is the main building, and right through those front doors is our advising office. And we have, like as I mentioned, we have a whole staff of both peer advisors, graduate students, and somebody named Dr. Barbara Luca, who oversees our advising program. And she is just I guess, dedicated to helping people progress through the major in a timely way, get the courses that they need, and get the courses they think will help them, prepare them for graduate school or for a career in one of the various subfields of psychology. So the psychology department actually houses 2 undergraduate majors. One is psychology and one is integrative neuroscience. They are both, we really take a real, what we call an empirical approach to the field. So psychology is the study of human behavior. And by empirical, I mean, we base our theories on observation. So you advance a theory of human behavior based on observations, usually in the lab. And, both psychology and integrative neuroscience have that as a goal. They have a bit of a different emphasis. So if you are interested in maybe the biological bases of behavior and the way that different brain mechanisms, brain areas, and brain systems would contribute to human behavior, then integrative neuroscience might be a more interesting field for you. We also have a lot of people that are pre-med that go into the IN major. Psychology, we're also interested in sort of explaining and predicting human behavior, but would take into account more the emotional, cognitive, and social aspects of that would account for human behavior. I will mention we also have one track within psychology, which is specialized with autism spectrum disorder. So we have a school and an institute that on campus here, and it's actually a really wonderful opportunity if you have an interest in working with that population, where we serve as a kind of a treatment center and a school for children with autism. And it's staffed in part by undergraduate students who work with the kids and help develop programs. And along the way, they have this wonderful track in autism autism spectrum disorders. It's a real, it's a pretty unique thing for an undergraduate program. So you may be interested in that. This next slide is just our faculty, and it's only here. There are, I think this photo was taken right after this new signage went up, and so there aren't a lot of faces. Everybody does have a face though, but I have it up here just to remind me to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in the department. We have kind of 3 sub areas: clinical, cognitive, that's my area, and behavioral neuroscience. And so people study a range of different topics. I mention that because a lot of students come in with an idea that they might want to get involved in some of the research happening here. And every single faculty member, I think almost everybody has undergraduate students that work with them in their laboratories, and every semester. And often people will stick around for more than, for 2 years, 2.5 years, sometimes, getting involved in the research that's happening. So we have people that study developmental psychology. We have people that study alcoholism and alcohol abuse. We have people that study, I study memory. We have people that study marriage and relationships. I'm just kind of looking through here to help me remember. People that study schizophrenia and so forth. So if you want to just kind of get a sense of what the faculty do here, because you may be able to get involved in that work, you can just check out the psych department website and read the different faculty bios. So as I mentioned, I am part of the cognitive area. It's called Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and I study human memory. And I thought I would just give you a little excerpt from a class I teach, like a 300 level course. Most of the students are juniors in the class on human memory. And we just kind of learn, as in the course of the course, you learn a lot about what makes people remember some things better than others. Why do we remember some stuff? Why do we forget other things? And so I thought I would just talk to you about how we remember our life story. So autobiographical memory is sort of your memory for your own experience and your own life experience. It's actually difficult to study in the lab because we really have no idea about the accuracy of these events. So if you might have a memory that's coming to mind right now, and you might tell somebody else that memory, and we don't know what really happened or how it happened. And so it is a challenge to study autobiographical memory in the lab. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that has been done and some of the interesting things that they've found with it. But when we think back to our lives, we often use the terminology mental time travel. And I just find that such an interesting, evocative. I've always been interested in time travel ever since I was a kid, any movie or TV show dealing with time travel. And so this is just, of course, the idea that you can mentally re-experience the past. It's a wonderful quality that we have just by thinking about the past, just kind of directing your attention back to something that happened to you in the past. And you can often remember the sights and the sounds and the smells that were involved with that past event. And so that's what we refer to as mental time travel. And the photo here, I don't know if you recognize it, but it's from the movie Titanic, and it's the character that named Rose, that is played by Kate Winslet. The younger version of the character is played by Kate Winslet. And this is her at the end of, towards the end of her life, where she's remembering back to a very emotionally laden and distinctive event, which was, ending up in a sunken ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, of course. And so to some extent, and the next line that she says in this movie, so it's been 84 years, and the next line is, and I can still smell the paint, the fresh paint on the boat, and the sound of dishes clanking. And so she's experiencing a vivid sense of time traveling back to the past mentally. And so the things that we know, that the things that make us remember an event later are some things that you probably have an intuition about, things that you pay attention to, that you give a lot of your attention to, you will remember. Things that we call it rehearsal, like you think about it like a stage rehearsal. We don't mean it like that. Usually we mean that you talk about it over and over again. So we'll all have those experiences that we recount over and over again with our friends, those old stories that come out every time you're together, that's what we would call rehearsal, kind of going over it over and over again. That stuff is more likely to be remembered. Things that are unusual, things that like sinking in the frigid Atlantic Ocean, that would be a distinctive event. So things that stand out from the background, of course, are remembered better, and things that are highly emotional are of course, remembered better. But what I wanted to talk about to you today is how the time in your life, the period of your life in which an event happens can impact your whether or not you remember it. So I'm going to talk about the things you remember best and the things that you remember worst. And so let's start by, I'm going to just ask you, and I think Carrie has a poll. Yes, it's up. So I want you to think of your earliest childhood memory and how old are you in that event? Okay, everybody's in. Okay, so the average, I don't know if you can see this poll result. Hi, everybody, by the way. It's always nice to have evidence that somebody's really out there. I always feel like I'm about to do the weather report on the news or something like that. But so that most people said 4, and that's exactly what research has found over and over again, that the period before the age of 4 tends to be remembered very poorly. So 3 or 4 is pretty typical. It is a hard task because often you don't have a full memory. You just have this like little fragment. You think you're in this house, but how old were you? Often it's not a fully formed memory. It's just like a little flash or fragment. And that's how memory starts out. The years basically before 3 are essentially lost. And I personally call them the lost years, but they're generally referred to as infantile amnesia. I'm going to try to advance this slide. So infantile amnesia is really stuff that happens to you before the age of 3 is almost not ever remembered, even when it's dramatic. They study people who've had extensive, hospitalizations or surgeries at the age of 2, 2.5, and they tend not to be remembered at all. Occasionally, if you're really close to 3, you can sometimes remember that stuff. And so this was just simply a well-known study where they asked people about whether they remembered their next youngest sibling being born, which is a really dramatic change in a person's life. There's really not too much more dramatic that can happen to a child than have another child move in, right? So you would tend to remember that, once you're the age of 4, don't worry about this graph too much, but 4, you remember a few things, 5, you remember, 6, you remember, but before that, really not at all. And so, that has been referred to as infantile amnesia. Now, the interesting thing is it's not like when you hit the age of 4, or it's children that are 1, 2, that are younger than that can form long-lasting memories, and they can hold on to them for a while, but it's like something happens it varies, but around the age of 8 or 9 to kind of you lose access to those memories. So it's not that kids younger than say 4, it's not that they can't remember stuff. They actually can. If you have any maybe nieces or nephews, younger cousins, and you ask them, and they're 2, they'll remember things that happened like the last time you saw them. Maybe it was a few months ago. Yeah, they can do that. But something happens where around the age of 8 or 9 that they lose access to that. And then adults, people your age, can't remember any of that stuff. There are a lot of different explanations that have been offered. We really don't know why this occurs. This does occur. It's not just humans. Any animals that are called attritial animals, so rats, monkeys, any animal that's born without a fully formed nervous system also experiences this sort of change, but that's probably not the full explanation. But it turns out guinea pigs are born, they're called precocial animals, and little fun fact, they don't go through this period of infantile amnesia. So if you have a guinea pig at home, they remember everything to the extent that they can remember stuff. So there's probably not enough time to really, if you have any questions about this at the end, I can talk to you about some of the explanations for why we don't why we lose access to those early memories. But I thought I would just segue into talking about what the parts of your life that we remember best. So I'm going to ask you to think. I'm going to give you just 4 sort of random words. And I want you to just think about a personal memory that that is associated with this word. So the word is lamp. And just think about a memory associated with that and when that occurred. Okay, so I think everybody responded. So the majority of you, I don't know if you can see these poll results, but the majority of you, there was a split, said that the event was in the last year. It was a fairly recent memory. I'm going to assume you're about, 17, 18 years old. And so you came up with something in the last year. That's typically, that's just kind of considered a recency effect. And that is pretty typical, especially for people your age. So let me, show you but what the research on this topic will do is it'll give you a bunch of these words, lamp, taxi, plate, horse, and just make you think of an event, write it down. This work is usually done on the internet. Even before the research wasn't fully online like it is at the moment, this was usually done with these large studies. Thousands and thousands of participants and volunteers did this work. And then they said how old they were during that memory. So instead of like, was it in the last year? They just said, what was your age when this event took place? And so what we develop, I'll just kind of unpack this graph for you. What we develop are what are called lifespan retrieval curves. That's just a fancy word for plotting out where those memories tend to fall in a person's lifespan. So just to orient you here, so this is the y-axis, the vertical axis, horizontal axis is the x-axis, and this is the age of a person when they had that memory. So whatever you thought of when you thought of lamp, this would be your age at that event. And so these are pretty young people like yourself. 18 to 20 is this blue line, this first line, and then this red line is 21 to 25. And you see here, N just means the number of people that were surveyed, and you see these are huge samples. And what this is kind of showing is these are people so these are 18 to 20-year-olds. What it's kind of showing is that people tend to come up with something. The overwhelming plurality of memories tend to come from a fairly recent period of time, last year or two or something like that. And as you get these people were a little bit older, 20, 25, they tended to remember stuff from the last couple of years. So that's just based on this little poll, that seems to be the pattern that you're showing. Now, this is only interesting because of how it changes over the lifespan. And I'm actually going to tell you, you've probably, if you're hanging out with your parents, and you're probably spending more time at home than you ever thought you would when you were 17, talking to your parents more than you ever, or guardians, or whoever you live with, more than you ever thought you would, about every topic in the world. I want you to ask them this question, come up with the word, ask them what they think of when they think of the word lamp. So your parents are probably at the outer edge of this lifespan 45, or maybe even a little bit older. And so I'll show you the next graph. But what you see here, we have 4 different groups of, adults that are a bit older than you. So this is the 26 to 30-year-olds, this green line. Purple line is 31 to 35, 36 to 40, and then 41 to 45. So maybe some of your parents are in that range, maybe these two at the end. Okay, so what you see emerging, you still have that recency portion. They are tending to come up with a story about a lamp or a taxi or a horse from the last year, but something is added on to their memories, which is this little bump. Do you see how this bump is emerging here that isn't happening for these younger people such as yourself? This little bump starts to appear, and it really starts to appear. It's most pronounced for this orange line because it starts to happen around the age of 40. So if your parents or older relatives, are 40 or above, you'll start to see this, but it gets really pronounced I'll show you the next one and then I'll just unpack it a little bit more. Okay, this is even older, so 46 to 78. Okay, so this would be my age group here. Okay, so this let's go with the most extreme, the oldest sample. This would be 71 to 78. So this might be, older relatives at grandparent age or something like that, would be somewhere in there. And so you see this really dramatic bump starting, and that's called the reminiscence bump. Started to appear here and when you're 40, and it's really pronounced with older people, and the recency portion of it starts to go down. And so what this means is that when they are just given something that triggers or asked to retrieve a memory from their life, they will time travel back, way back to a time period, roughly, it varies, but it's like maybe age 10 through 30. Even though they've had many, many decades, a 78-year-old person has so many decades that they could sample from, but they don't. It's almost like when that time travel machine, it's like an express stop that goes back to their teenage years and early 20s. So I want you to try this and see, the next time you're at a family dinner with older relatives, see if this happens. Just ask them to tell you something about their life from some neutral cue word. So that is called the reminiscence bump. And basically, the idea is that things that happen to us when we are in our teens, early 20s, and this is your age now, tend to be remembered really well. They have a disproportionate they take up a disproportionate amount of real estate in our lives throughout our lives. It's interesting because it really starts to show up around the age of 40. 30-year-olds don't really do this. They don't travel back to the teenage years the way that older adults do. And there are various theories about it. I will just just mention a couple things that you should know about that. One is that it is not the case that it's just an American or North American phenomenon. It is, so these are the same curves that I just showed you, only the participants were specifically said, don't avoid anything from the last year, because they just wanted to get rid of that little recency portion and just see whether that bump happened at the same place across many different countries. And so everywhere that it has been tested, even though there's like a little bit of a difference here across these samples, but generally you see this bump that is occurring, and it tends to center, like I said, teens and early 20s. And so it seems quite universal. So people often ask, is this just because of the sort of cultural significance that is in play in the US, and maybe, but it happens across different cultures that have a different age at which you might, significant events might happen to you in your life. I will mention some positive things about this. One of the things is that if you look at what the content of those memories. So you ask your grandmother, tell me something. I'm just going to give you the word lamp. Just tell me any story from your life. And then they tell you that. And then you later, or after they get done, you ask them, now, is that a positive memory or negative memory or neutral memory? The interesting thing is that even when these events sound neutral, they tend to be remembered positively. They have a positive association with them. So it's really only positive memories that show up in that reminiscence bump. It's not that we don't remember negative stuff. We do remember negative stuff. In fact, certainly traumatic experiences tend to be remembered really well. But when people just volunteer these things to a neutral cue, they tend to travel back to teens and 20s, and they tend to feel positively about the stuff that happened. So this is fantastic Bruce Springsteen song that you should, if you're not familiar with it, you should go to YouTube or wherever and play it. It's called Glory Days. And it's somebody who's in middle age thinking back to their time in high school and their glory days. And part of what makes it the glory, that's somewhat seen as a little bit of a pejorative term, meaning that you're living in the past when you peaked. But it's it's because even kind of neutral, boring things like the stuff that's happening to you now that isn't super exciting, when you are my age, you will look back at it and kind of feel sort of positively about it. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell you about the reminiscence bump. One of the things that one of the cultural kind of, I guess, touchstones is this idea that people are often telling teenagers or people in their early adulthood, this is the best time of your life. These are the best years of your life. Often that comes from people who are much older thinking back. And I will say that often it's the case that when they are experiencing those events, they're not very happy with those events. And it's only later that they get kind of this rosy glow over those things. So that's one reason that people look back and say that you are now living in the best time of your life. It's because when they look back, those things seem more positive, even when at the time that they experienced them, they didn't feel super positive at the time. So that is, so just to kind of, I'll tell you, we don't know why this happens, right? That's usually psychologists, what we like to do is delineate a phenomenon, we find out the facts, and then you want to explain it. Why does it occur? And so this is kind of taking us back to, when I said at the beginning, autobiographical memory is sort of hard to study because we can't put people in a lab for their entire life and control what they experience and then find out how accurate they are and see whether their dating of these memories is actually accurate or not. So there are a lot of challenges to really figuring out why this occurs, but there are a lot of different explanations that make sense and that mesh with other things that we know about the human memory system. One thing is that you are at your age in your peak mental acuity. Actually, you've got a few more years till you peak. So that's the good news. It'll be mid-20s. You'll keep getting sharper and sharper, and then it starts to decline. So this does coincide with the period at which you can learn very quickly, you can memorize very quickly, even if I know you're probably studying for a lot of exams and things like that. Maybe it doesn't feel like you can remember it as well as you would like, but trust me, you're pretty expert memorizers compared to the general population. So it is a time of peak mental acuity. And so maybe those things are just more strongly held because everything is remembered, that you do is remembered better at that age due to biological reasons. Another thing is there are a lot of very distinctive things that happen because it's the first time. It's the first, getting the first time you drive your car, your first speeding ticket, your first, everything, first rejection. So everything feels very new. And we know that when something's very novel, you pay more attention to it and it's more memorable. And people have also kind of noticed that it is when people's kind of idea of like their life narrative really kind of starts to begin, this idea that you really are an autonomous person separate from your parents and your life story really does come online at that point. That's kind of a cultural and social psychology explanation for it. So so that's the reminiscence bump. I will just mention one other kind of cool thing about the reminiscence bump, which is that the pattern that I showed you is true for kind of neutral words or maybe music and things like that. It is not true for odor memories, what we call olfactory memories. So we know that because of where odor is processed in the brain, it's in an area called the olfactory bulb. It's very close to the centers that deal with emotion and memory. And we think because of its proximity, probably, odor memories are remembered very, very well. And they tend to create a sense of mental time travel back instead of to what I would call the second decade of life, like 10 to 20, the first decade of life. And in fact, really, because if I would just, instead of giving you a word like lamp or a word like coffee, instead I give you say a mason jar where you can't see what's in it because it's kind of covered, and I just have you smell coffee beans, it will, or bleach or lemon or anything, alcohol, anything distinctive. We're all going to remember the smell of hand sanitizer, right? That's what we'll all be right back in 2020 when we smell that New York State hand sanitizer for the rest of our lives. But generally speaking, it will transport you back to actually the ages between basically 5 and 10, because you don't tend to remember stuff before the age of 5 very well. And so it's a very narrow band. So odor cues actually kind of transport you back to an even earlier period of time. So so I think that that's kind of a really interesting thing. And so ask when you are talking to your older adults, maybe give them something to smell and just say, what does this remind you of? And they'll go back to like a lemon meringue pie that they had when they were, 7, instead of like something that just happened to them in the last year. So those memories are older. And there are, if you come and you take my class on human memory, we'll talk about different explanations for why we think that happens. So to sum up here, what part of your life story will you remember? This is such an unusual time that we're all going through. And in a lot of ways, we'll probably remember this time period and we'll keep referring to it a lot throughout our lives. It'll be a real touchstone for us because it's been a lot, right? And at the same time, it's also so kind of monotonous and boring, like the same thing every day. And a lot of you probably are taking your classes from the same computer. And I'm always in this chair, no matter what happens to me, no matter what kind of meeting I have, I'm just staring at the same kind of screen. So there are some aspects of this situation now that really suggest we're not going to remember this period very well in any distinct way. So that's why I wanted to talk about this, because I've been really curious about what we're going to find about people's autobiographical memories from this time period. At the same time, you're very much in the period of your life that people remember this stuff really, really well. And so, when you're just thinking what parts of your life story will you remember? Well, probably everything from like basically below the age of 3 is already gone. No point in worrying about that. That's normal. But assuming that you're between 16 and 25, it's the stuff that's happening to you now that you're going to remember really well, even the mundane stuff that seems mundane. And the good news of that is that later you're going to think back and remember it really positively. People let's put it this way, more positively than you're experiencing it now. It's not like terrible things become like magical, wonderful events, nothing like that. But things that are kind of neutral or maybe even seem kind of boring, you will start to remember it a little bit more positively. I had a lot of just kind of terrible jobs when I was in high school and college, waitressing in terrible places with terrible bosses and all that stuff. And I'll be like, oh, wasn't that fun? Just like refilling the ketchup bottles. I have this positive association with that. So anyway, so I'm gonna, we're probably all a little bit zoomed out right now, so I'll stop right now. But I look forward to hearing any questions you might have about whether it's about the major or about anything specific with memory. You can ask me anything. So.
Thanks so much, Deanne. We do have that came through. I think it's a really good one, kind of relating to your topic of research. But why is it that sometimes we can recall an event but can't seem to remember exactly what happened or when exactly it happened?
Yeah. Okay. So we tend to remember just what we would call the gist of things, like that kind of like detail, where you were, who told you, that stuff. It's just harder to remember. Those are kind of details. They're not really, it's sort of like how you'll remember a movie and you remember the general plot, but what shirt a character was wearing or exactly how things laid out. It's kind of the way that you would remember a movie. You remember the general gist of it. And that's probably good. There's actually a lot of research that suggests that, forgetting the details of stuff is probably a good idea. The fact that you kind of remember what we would consider the important stuff, the main idea of things. Our memory systems, I'm sure, have adapted because that's the important stuff. So we tend to remember stuff that, caused us danger, right? Where our fear memories are really quickly held, and the general idea of things. So we don't have to repeat things over and over again. But usually the details, if you want to remember it, right? And you probably students, you do kind of have to remember the details. You have to remember the details in college. It takes a lot of work. It's not a natural experience. That's when you form mnemonic devices to help you remember this list of things or something like that. That is, the why is hard to explain, other than probably it is something that has become adaptive over the course of our lives, to have really strong memories for the general experience, because that will help us survive. But the details are not super important. And so you're going to weigh, whenever in your memory, the stuff that was actually important to help you with the longevity of the species, essentially, is going to just be weighted more heavily, and therefore will be remembered better. So forgetting, one of the things that you learn in this field is how incredibly adaptive forgetting is. I think that we focus on our failures of memory, and we wish we would have a better memory. But there are some people who really do have basically a neuropsychological condition, whether it's due to, they're not exactly sure what it's due to, but it's probably related to some sort of variation in their brain that have trouble remembering. Have trouble forgetting stuff. And they remember details of their autobiographical memory, like it happened yesterday, or like it happened an hour ago. And it can be very problematic. They also don't do better in school, which is interesting. So I would tell you, after you learn some of these case studies, you will thank heavens that you can forget stuff. I would also say that, one of the symptoms of PTSD is, of course, having unwanted, vivid memories for stuff that happened to you in the past. So forgetting is generally a blessing. Usually be grateful that you just remember the general gist of things, and that's probably the way it should be. It probably helps you focus on the future a little bit better, and you shouldn't spend too much time probably reflecting on the past, because in fact, I will just say one other thing. People have been, if you take my class, we'll talk about this a good bit. Probably, the purpose of memory generally is to help us plan for the future. So you take what you would need to help you adapt and plan for the future. And usually those kind of details are not especially important for that.
So you mentioned PTSD and kind of how that affects things. We have a question about, does trauma affect how you remember things? So maybe we can elaborate on that just a little.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, and I should mention that we actually have people in the faculty that are really experts on this and really just deal with, that's their main thing that they study is trauma. So, and I would say it depends, and it really depends on whether it's a single experience or a repeated experience, but certainly it certainly does have effect on your memory for an experience. It's somewhat individual. So, but a kind of a common thing that you will hear is that they will remember the experience, but everything is very kind of fragmented and fuzzy. They don't have a good linear account of things. And so this is something that comes up with eyewitness memory. So, if you are a victim of a crime, you will, there's kind of something that happens in memory where you get very focused on the central event. It'll be called a weapons focus. It's not, it's kind of almost like a cliche, like you're being mugged at gunpoint or something like that, where you will focus on the thing in the environment that you perceive as most dangerous, and everything else is very fuzzy, and so it depends. There are a lot of factors. When you are in a fearful state, a lot of things happen with memory. One of those things is they're kind of, you're listening to me now and you're thinking about the words I'm saying, and that is processed in a system that's called working memory. And one thing that we know is that when you are when you are under a lot of fear, whether it's something as kind of mundane as test anxiety, or you're like truly feeling like your life is threatened, your working memory is kind of flooded. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Like I have had an experience where I've gotten so nervous if I had to do a public speaking that if somebody asked me my name, it would be a very effortful mental task because I almost can't process what's happening. And so you see that happening. And so people will remember the central event, but a lot of the details are going to be lost. And that's a really common way that we know that traumatic memories, you tend to remember the event forever. So this idea that you kind of repress traumatic events and don't remember it at all is not a common thing. In case you've heard that, but doesn't mean you talk about it all the time, but usually people remember it. Even if they're not thinking about it, but it can be very fuzzy. It can be surprisingly fuzzy, except for, kind of what you consider the main gist of it. So I hope that answered your question, but that's a really big topic. And it's a super important topic. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. How can we make sense of déjà vu?
Oh, thank you for asking that. So I actually usually give a lecture because a lot of my research, I study illusions of familiarity, and it's been connected to the déjà vu experience. So one of the, so nobody really knows what déjà vu is. It is, and not everybody experiences it. So there, of the people on the call, probably about 75% have had that feeling that they've been somewhere before or experienced something before. And it's almost like, and then it's gone. You kind of have that feeling and it doesn't persist. So I'm wondering if my description of it fits your experience. So, part of the problem, it's very difficult to study because most people have a couple of episodes a year. It's also something, and it's very difficult to trigger it. People have tried to trigger it in the lab, and every paradigm that I know that has tried to trigger it, I feel very skeptical of. They're not really having that real strong sense of like, oh, I've definitely been here before. So I'm just mostly going to mention so it's very challenging to study. You can't induce it in the lab, very infrequent. It becomes increasingly infrequent with age. So if you ask your parents, I bet they don't have déjà vu as much as you do. So it is almost like a negative linear thing. And I'm very interested in it because it connects to my research, and I never really experienced it. But when I was in high school, I felt like it was, like not an uncommon experience. And I would love to know if, you never know what other generations are what they're experiencing, but that might be a conversation. So, it really declines a lot after the age of, say, 25 or something like that. And so that kind of points to that doesn't necessarily tell us that it's a biological thing. So one of the things I will just kind of explain, so some of my research, I can induce little illusions of familiarity in the lab. I can make you think you've seen a face before or a thing before if I just kind of give you a quick preview of it, a quick flash of it, like at 35 milliseconds. So sometimes what we think happens is you have kind of this re-experiencing, you experience something and and then you, like, milliseconds later, kind of re-experience, you re-perceive it. It's almost like a second perception. It doesn't mean it's like a brain hiccup. It just means it could just mean like you glance around a room and then you glance around a room again, and it creates this eerie sense of familiarity. But often it's because it's all connected. It's all part of the same experience, but you've lost track of the fact that it's more familiar because you were already living in that moment. This is becoming a bit abstract here, but whoever asked that question, I would love to talk to you about it more if you come here. And the research that I'm doing in my lab is actually somewhat connected to it because we can create illusions of familiarity in the lab, but usually we use stimuli like faces or things like that. You can get people to falsely think that that somebody looks familiar or a song looks familiar because you have tinkered with some of the aspects that affect how easily you can perceive it. So that's not a very satisfying answer, but hopefully you at least learned something interesting with that. It's a very, the more you get into science, the more you realize there's a lot we don't know. And even the things that we think we're sure we know of, usually there's some paper, a series of some literature that's contradicting what we consider like the conventional wisdom. So it's very evolving field. So, I saw a tweet the other day that said that they can kind of distinguish when people are on like Twitter and they're either talking science or nonsense, you can almost tell which is which depending on their certainty. That the more certain people are about anything, the less they probably know about science, if they're talking about a scientific conclusion, because all of our conclusions are always quite tentative, and usually there are multiple explanations that are being entertained, and there's usually some evidence for a lot of them. So.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions here, and they're great questions, so I want to make sure we get to them. So the first is, how do your senses enhance your ability to remember the details of a memory or event, like something written or a smell?
Yeah, so, things, odor cues are really, really good triggers. It's hard to kind of to think of how to work that so that you'll remember your test better, but it will take you back. So associated with a real feeling of mental time travel, if you walk into, I recently had to go to the hospital with my father, and we went into and I smelled like the cleaner that was in this hospital, and it just took me back to it just transports you back. They must use the same, must never change hospital cleaners. I swear, it took me back 30 years to a hospital I was, in a million years ago. So, so odors, everything contributes. So when you perceive an event, it has, if it's it might have an auditory component, a visual component, olfactory component. Humans, if you look at our occipital lobe, the areas of our brain that are devoted to vision, it's kind of disproportionate. We are largely visual. We've adapted to so that our visual cortex, our visual areas of our brain are quite large compared to a rat, which would have a much larger olfactory bulb, or my beagles at home that probably that I think don't have great vision, but they could smell a squirrel 2 miles away. So as humans, vision is going to be sort of primary in terms of when we remember stuff. It tends to be a visual experience, and maybe you're experiencing that now. If you think back to an early event, you kind of see it in your mind's eye, generally speaking, and auditory, olfactory, that stuff. It's probably there, but it's harder to kind of recall or reconstruct yourself. It tends to be a little bit more of a visual experience, and that's probably related to the kind of disproportionate size. Maybe it's not just, maybe it's proportionate to what we need, but the fairly large size of our brain that is encompassed by the visual areas of our brain. So you encode all of that stuff. You also encode stuff that you're not even aware of, like the sound of a room, like lights humming, the sound of traffic. And speaking of that, often, whenever you have kind of bringing it back to the deja vu experience, you have in those, as you go through your life, you are what we call encoding that stuff is coming in. You are usually not super aware of it. And so sometimes one of the explanations of deja vu is that you just hear a sound from your past and it resurrects this old memory. But you don't realize it's a memory. It's, you in a way, you have been there before. You have kind of had some part of that experience that was replicated because of the lighting in the room or a configuration in the room. And it feels much more familiar than it should, given that you have not exactly experienced that. And so, kind of whenever you are experiencing an event, you encode all of those other little details. And then when they reappear later, that can just trigger a past memory and give you a feeling. If it's very vague and kind of a slight memory, it might just trigger a sense of deja vu. If it's a strong memory, it'll create that strong sense of mental time travel where you feel like you're living back in that experience. So there's also a theory I'll just kind of mention that the more senses that are involved. So if you hear something and see something, you're going to remember it better. And that kind of just makes sense than if you simply see it or you simply hear it. But we also know there are individual differences on this. The whole idea of learning styles, like some people, visual learners and auditory learners, the research on that is kind of showing that that's not really a real thing. There are some things that are remembered better than others, but you usually can't find these subgroups of, most people kind of have the same, you won't find people that are really these distinct subgroups. I think that that was like a real popular idea, not really based on a lot of data from a few years ago, in case you've heard of that. So I hope that scratched the surface of an answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. One final question here. We are getting to the top of the hour. I want to thank all of our students here on here for wonderful questions. I think this has been a great discussion as well, even after your presentation. So the final question here, you mentioned people who have trouble forgetting things, and this goes along with that, remembering and having the visual stimulation. But does that mean they have a photographic memory? How is that kind of related?
Yeah, so photographic memory is one of those things you see on a lot of TV shows. I mean, every time, like, you're watching Law and Order, somebody, of course, some witness, of course, has a photographic memory. So photographic memory is largely mythical. And it is mostly a device that is used in movies. There are some children who do seem, and it's probably because over the course of like your early years, you go through a process called neural pruning, which you're born with many, many more synaptic connection than you have now. And they kind of, things that are redundant fade away. Young children, you can find some young children, usually fades by the age of 5, who do have a photographic memory. And to really test that, they would give them basically like a Where's Waldo kind of thing, have them stare at it, look at it, and then take it away and then ask them questions. And there are very, very, very few people, and all under the age of 5, who can answer questions as though they can still see it. So photographic memory does not exist. They're probably now that we have, though, the ability to communicate more with people all over the world, there's probably some case study of like one person who has something approaching that. There are people with incredibly phenomenal memories, however. And so often it's just kind of used to mean somebody with a really, really good memory. So, but photographic memory would mean like you could look at a complex visual scene, take it away, and they could answer it like they were still looking at it. And that doesn't seem to be, if it is possible, it's probably, there are 7 billion people in the world. It's like 3 people. Now, the people, though, with the condition I mentioned, it's called highly superior autobiographical memory. And you can Google it and watch some YouTube videos on it, HSAM. And there's a woman named Jill Price, who was the first one who was found to have this. And I think people thought she was making it up. And now there are all these people that are documented to have it. So it's unusual, but it's not like impossible at all. So do they have photographic memories? No, it's interesting. And a lot of them, if you look at their grades, or you give them a laboratory task, they don't do much better than you or I would do. Their grades are pretty average. And so it seems to be only related to remembering the events of their life, and nobody's testing them on that. You don't get any points for that. But in laboratory tests, they're only slightly better than the average person. So they certainly don't have a photographic memory. So that's one of the puzzles. Like if you could remember literally every day of your life, from the age of 14 on, like, what you ate for dinner, what you watched for TV, what you were wearing, like it's still in front of you. Why can't you apply that to laboratory tasks? And nobody knows the answer to that. Or why can't you apply it to your studies, right? Or your MCATs or whatever, but nobody understands that yet.
I guess that's why the research is always continuing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'll still
Part
have
of
a
the
job.
fun of the field.
Yep, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Deanne. This has been really wonderful. I thank everyone for staying on for this whole time. I hope you've enjoyed this and gotten as much out of it as I know we have. I'm going to share our admissions website or information here in the chat. If you have any questions, I know some of us might have been admitted students and you're excited to be part of the psychology department maybe coming this fall. We have students on here that are still shopping around and thinking about where to apply in the fall, and maybe you're juniors. So to both groups of students, we're here for you. We want to help answer any questions that you might have. Deanne, thank you again so much for coming on. I think this has been really wonderful. If you would like to share your email in here, you can certainly do that as well, or we can.
Sure, I'll stick it in the chat. It's just wester@binghamton.edu.
Okay, great. At binghamton.edu. So if you have questions for Professor Westerman, questions for us in the admissions department, please do feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk about Binghamton. We'd love to talk about the psychology department more, what we can do for you. And thank you again so much, Dr. Westerman, for chatting with us. This has been great. I hope everyone has gotten as much out of this as we have. And we hope to see you all here, maybe on campus soon in the fall, maybe here for a visit. And we'd love to talk to you later. Thanks so much again.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.